In the last lecture, I stressed that it's important to understand the events of Jesus' last days in light of his overall proclamation. Reconstructions of Jesus' life that cannot connect his death with his life are highly implausible. An apocalyptic understanding of his message, though, makes considerable sense of what happened to him at the end. Jesus came to Jerusalem in order to proclaim his apocalyptic message in the heart of Judaism. He believed that the end was imminent, and people needed to repent before the Son of Man arrived in judgment. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he acted out his message by performing a kind of parabolic action in the temple, overturning tables as an illustration of the destruction that was coming. It was this that led ultimately to his arrest. As the authorities in charge of the temple, the chief priests connected with the Sadduceic party, decided to have Jesus taken out of the way when he began to attract larger crowds, wanting to nip the problem in the bud rather than allow him to stir up the mob. In this lecture, we'll pick up at this point, seeing what can be established as historically reliable information about Jesus' final hours. It's almost certain that Jesus was betrayed by one of his 12 disciples named Judas Iscariot. There are several people in the New Testament who are named Judas. It's the same word as Jude. In fact, Jesus, according to the Gospel of Mark, has a brother with the same name, Jude. Usually his name is given Jude, and Judas Iscariot is given Judas, I think probably just to differentiate them in English. Iscariot is a difficult term. We aren't sure what it means exactly. Probably Iscariot is given to differentiate this Judas from other Judases named in the New Testament. But what Iscariot actually refers to is hard to say. In Hebrew, Ishkariot could mean something like man, Ish, from the village of Kerioth. Or it could be that this is something to do with a family name, Iscariot. We aren't sure exactly what Iscariot means. Most people in this world don't have two names. People just have one name. So Jesus didn't have a last name. People who have more than one name are usually people who are in the aristocracy of Rome. They have usually three names. But these people just have one. In any event, it's relatively certain that Jesus was betrayed by one of his own 12, and it appears that this was a man named Judas Iscariot. The reason for thinking that it's relatively certain is that the event is multiply attested all over the map. We have an account of in Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 14. It's also picked up then by Matthew and Luke. But also independently of Mark, we have an account in John's Gospel, John 18, of Judas Iscariot turning Jesus in. And also an account in the book of Acts, chapter 1, that talks about Judas. Interestingly, also, the Apostle Paul may refer to Jesus' betrayal. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 23. This is a passage where Paul is talking to the Corinthians about their need to celebrate the Lord's Supper in a proper way. And the way he gets to explaining how they need to celebrate this meal properly is by recounting how Jesus himself celebrated it. This is the longest passage in which Paul gives a tradition from Jesus' own life, the account of the Lord's Supper. He begins the account by saying, though, in the night in which he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread. It's an interesting reference because he doesn't mention Judas Iscariot. Judas's name never occurs in Paul's writings. But he does say that this happened on the night Jesus was betrayed. And so most people have taken this as a reference to the betrayal narrative. It's somewhat complicated, though, because the term in Paul that is translated betrayed, the term paradidomi in Greek, is a term that Paul more regularly uses to refer not to the act of betrayal, but to the act of God handing Jesus over to his suffering. And so instead of referring to the betrayal narrative, Paul may be simply referring to the night that God handed Jesus over to his death. So that, in other words, this may not be support of the Judas tradition, or it may be. Scholars debate. Even without 1 Corinthians 11, though, the account is multiply attested, Mark, John, and Acts. Moreover, as I noted in an earlier lecture, this is not the sort of tradition that Christians would be inclined to make up, that Jesus was turned over by one of his 12, that he had no more authority or power over his closest followers than that. Given that it passes both independent attestation and dissimilarity, it looks like this is something that actually happened. What's not clear, though, is what it was that Judas betrayed. What was it that he betrayed? The common notion is that Judas simply told the authorities where they could find Jesus apart from the crowds. And so Judas told them, well, he goes out regularly to pray in Gethsemane, so you can go and you can find him there. It's possible that that's what he told the authorities. I have to say, though, that I've always found that a little bit odd, that the authorities would have to pay an insider to get that kind of information. Why couldn't they simply have him followed? It may be that that's what he betrayed, but it seems to me that something else might be going on. It's possible that Judas betrayed something else. That is, that he divulged information that the authorities could actually use against Jesus when they wanted to bring him up on charges. I want to explore that possibility at some length in the first part here of this lecture. It's striking that in the various accounts of Jesus' trials that we'll be discussing later, Jesus is charged with calling himself such things as the Messiah, the Son of God, the King of the Jews. These are charges leveled against Jesus that he's calling himself things that are thought either to be religiously blasphemous or to be politically dangerous. King of the Jews, Messiah. The problem is that in Jesus' public teachings that we've established as historically reliable, Jesus never calls himself these things. In our earliest source, the Gospel of Mark, when someone does call Jesus the Messiah, Jesus hushes it up. Mark chapter 8, verse 30, Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? Well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're a prophet raised from the dead. Jesus said, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter replies, you are the Messiah. And Jesus says, don't tell anybody. And then he goes on to teach that he has to go to Jerusalem and be executed. Well, Jesus isn't exactly propounding the idea that he's the Messiah. And in these early sources, he doesn't go around saying that he's the Messiah. He doesn't ever say that, in fact, until after he's arrested. Why would he be put on trial for saying something that he didn't say? Is it possible that this is what Judas betrayed? We know that Jesus taught his disciples privately things that he didn't say in public. That's presumably one of the reasons for having an inner circle. Did Judas betray insider information to the authorities about what Jesus was saying about himself? If so, then we might have a clue into Jesus' self-sense, into what Jesus thought about himself, at least as he told his disciples. I want to explore this possibility in some greater detail. We have several hints in our sources about what Jesus taught his disciples. They're no more than hints, but they're clearly there in our traditions, things that Judas might have divulged to the authorities. These hints come by way of several curious pieces of information that all look to be historically reliable. It's almost certain that the charge leveled against Jesus by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, the thing that ended up getting Jesus executed, was that Jesus considered himself to be the king of the Jews. Mark chapter 15, verse 2, John chapter 18, verse 33. It's multiply attested that Jesus is executed for calling himself the king of the Jews. That's a political offense, of course, because only the Romans can appoint a king. If you're not appointed the king by the Romans, that means you've got to overcome whatever king the Romans have appointed. It's a political charge. But Jesus never calls himself this in any of our Gospels. Jesus doesn't go around saying, I'm the King of the Jews. Why would he be executed for a claim he never made? Moreover, during Jesus' trial before the Jewish authorities, Jesus first appears before Jewish authorities, then they take him to see Pilate. They hold a kind of preliminary investigation before turning him over. Jesus was evidently charged with calling himself the Messiah. The Messiah, in Jewish circles, as we've seen, could refer to a number of different figures. It could refer to a cosmic judge coming on the clouds of heaven. It could refer to a great priest who was going to be an interpreter of the law. More commonly, apparently, it was thought to be some kind of future ruler of the people of Israel, a person of grandeur and power. We've seen that Jesus appears to have spurned the title Messiah in reference to himself in public. Nonetheless, it's possible that in one sense Jesus may have thought that he was the Messiah. Remember, Jesus taught that the Son of Man was going to execute judgment upon the earth, and that afterwards the kingdom of heaven, kingdom of God, would arrive. Kingdoms, by their very nature, have kings. Who would be the king of this coming kingdom in the teaching of Jesus? Well, publicly, he never says. On one level, of course, the ruler is going to be God himself. That's why Jesus calls it the kingdom of God. But he probably didn't think that God himself was going to physically come down to earth and sit on the throne in Jerusalem. Who then is going to be the king of this kingdom? There are several indications in our earliest traditions that Jesus thought that he himself would be the one who would be enthroned. For one thing, only those who accepted his message would be accepted into the kingdom. In other words, there's an intimate tie between Jesus and this kingdom. You have to accept what he says to be admitted. More importantly, though, he appears to have told his disciples that they would be seated on 12 thrones ruling the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, okay, there'll be 12 rulers, but who would be ruling them? Remember, it was Jesus himself who called them to be the 12. He is their master here on earth. They are his disciples. Moreover, we have traditions in which the disciples ask him for permission to sit on his right and his left in the coming kingdom. Mark 10, verse 37. Evidently, the disciples understood that he would be the ruler in this kingdom just as he was their ruler now. As a final piece of the puzzle, it's almost certain that some people during Jesus' lifetime believed that he would be the future ruler of Israel. Not just the disciples, but probably some of the disciples. Some of the disciples, but not just the disciples, thought that he would be a future ruler. Otherwise, it's virtually impossible to explain why, after his death, people came to call Jesus the Messiah. Let me explain what I mean. I think the common assumption that people have is that if anyone came to think that Jesus was raised from the dead, they would naturally say, well, he must be the Messiah. That's faulty logic, though, because there weren't any Jews who thought the Messiah was going to be raised from the dead, so far as we know. We have lots of sources of early Judaism, lots of accounts that talk about a future ruler of some kind, a future Messiah figure. In no Jewish text of any kind that survives from antiquity is there any statement at all that the Messiah is going to be one who dies and then is raised from the dead. This kind of idea is not found in the Hebrew Bible. It's not found in Jewish writings during the first century. That means, though, that if Jesus' followers called him the Messiah after his death, it wouldn't have been because they believed he was raised, because the Messiah wasn't supposed to be raised. They wouldn't have called him the Messiah later unless they were calling him the Messiah earlier. In other words, they may have thought that he was the Messiah. He gets crucified. That disconfirms their belief. But then when he's raised from the dead, they think, oh, God has vindicated him. He really is the Messiah. See, it wouldn't lead them to think he was the Messiah, but it might confirm something they had earlier thought. If that construction of things is right, I think that part is pretty certain, then some of Jesus' followers, not just his disciples, may have thought that he was the Messiah prior to his death. And yet, in the early accounts, Jesus doesn't teach that he's the Messiah. And he discourages people who do think so from noising it about. All right, how do we tie together all of these data? I think the best way to explain all of these data together is to say that Jesus' teachings about himself were intimately related to his apocalyptic proclamation that the end of the age was coming soon, that the arrival of the Son of Man was imminent, that the kingdom of God was almost here. Those who heeded his words would enter into that kingdom. This would be God's kingdom, ruled by his chosen ones, the 12 disciples on 12 thrones. And Jesus himself, as he must have taught the 12, I think, Jesus himself would have ruled over them in this kingdom. In effect, Jesus would be the king of God's coming kingdom. In that apocalyptic sense, that Jesus is the ruler of the future kingdom, and I would say only in that apocalyptic sense, did Jesus think of himself as the Messiah. He wasn't a cosmic judge. He wasn't an authoritative priest. He wasn't a military leader that was going to drive out the Romans. He was the one sent from God to proclaim the good news of the coming kingdom, and he would be the one who would be its ultimate ruler when the end arrived. In this reconstruction of the things, then, Judas betrayed this private teaching of Jesus to the authorities. Judas told the authorities what Jesus had been teaching them about his role in this coming kingdom. That's why they could level the charges against Jesus that he called himself the Messiah, the King of the Jews. He didn't teach this publicly, he did it privately, but they could charge him with it because Judas told him, and then Jesus couldn't deny it. Jesus meant it in the apocalyptic sense. Yes, I'm the King of the Jews in this future kingdom. They meant it, though, in a kind of this worldly sense. Are you the Messiah, the King of the Jews? He has to, at his trials then, admit that he thinks that he is, and that's what leads then to his execution. All right, in this reconstruction of things then, Judas didn't just betray where they could find Jesus. He actually gave them the grounds they needed to charge Jesus with what they charged him. I think understanding this ties together all sorts of things, including this problem that they end up executing Jesus for calling himself something that he never calls himself. It's difficult to know why Judas might have gone about betraying this sort of information to the authorities. What motivated Judas? Some people have thought that he did it for the money. Matthew chapter 26 indicates this, that the authorities had agreed to pay Judas 30 pieces of silver. Unfortunately for this idea, this reference in Matthew is actually an allusion to a prophecy in the Hebrew Bible, Zechariah chapter 11, verse 12, where a person receives 30 pieces of silver and then casts it over to the potter. Remember, Judas ends up killing himself in this field of blood that is a potter's field. It looks like, in other words, this tradition of the 30 pieces of silver is used to show that this is a fulfillment of prophecy. In other words, it can't pass the criterion of dissimilarity. And so people have come up with other reasons for thinking that Judas did it. Some have argued, reasonably I think, that Judas had grown disillusioned when he realized that Jesus was not the person he thought he was. In other words, that Judas may have thought that Jesus really was going to be some kind of political, military Messiah who was going to rouse the forces up and drive out the Romans. And when that didn't happen, out of disillusionment, he turned Jesus in. That's possible. Others have reasoned that Judas wanted to force Jesus' hand, thinking that if Jesus were arrested, he would call out for support and start an uprising that would overthrow the Romans. And so in order to compel Jesus to do what Judas wanted him to do, that again is plausible, I think. Each of these explanations has some merit. In the end, I'm afraid we're never really going to know what it was that motivated Judas to do what he did. We have two accounts, by the way, of what ended up happening to Judas. In the Gospel of Matthew, we're told that Judas went out and hanged himself afterwards out of regret. And what happens then is he casts the money back into the temple out of regret. He hangs himself, and the priests who've given him the money then can't use them. They can't put the money back in the treasury because it's blood money, money that's been to betray innocent blood. And so they use it to buy a potter's field, the field of blood, because it's bought with blood money. The book of Acts has an account of Judas dying, but it doesn't say that Judas hanged himself. In fact, it doesn't say he committed suicide. It says that he burst forth in the midst, and his bowels gushed out on the earth. It's not clear what that's referring to. What people have tried to do over the years is to reconcile the two accounts by saying that Judas hanged himself, and maybe the rope broke, and then he kind of gushed out over the earth, or some other way of reconciling it. If you didn't know about the account in Matthew of him hanging himself, though, it would sound like Judas kind of spontaneously burst. There are traditions in the 2nd century that that's what happened, that Judas actually swelled up, sort of a supernatural thing. He just became so immense that he finally just kind of split open and died. In the book of Acts, that happens in a field, and it's called the field of blood because that's where Judas kind of spilled forth his blood. It looks like, historically, somehow Judas must have died in this field, and it was associated with his death. It may have been a field that was composed of red clay. It was a potter's field, and so people called it the field of blood because it had red clay. But then somehow it got associated with Judas's death. All right, back to Jesus' last hours. Our early sources all agree that after having a last meal with his disciples, Jesus was arrested by Jewish authorities. I think it's pretty clear Jesus was arrested by the Jewish authorities. This has been led, of course, over the years to claims that Jews were responsible for Jesus' death, but these accounts are pretty clear that it's not the Jews who are responsible for Jesus' death, it's the Jewish authorities, the leaders. Jesus had enemies in the hierarchy of the temple authorities, and these are the ones who were responsible for arresting Jesus and then to conducting a kind of preliminary investigation against him. As local aristocrats, the Jewish high priests in the temple were allowed by the Romans to conduct and control their own internal affairs. The head of the group of the chief priests was the high priest. He was the head officer, as it were, of the temple, who was given jurisdiction by the Romans to conduct basic internal affairs among the Jews. During this time, the high priest was a man named Caiaphas, who was the high priest throughout the governorship of Pontius Pilate. There are some things to suggest that Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas were closely linked to one another. When Pontius Pilate was removed from his duties by the Romans, eventually his behavior became too atrocious even for the Romans to handle him. He was a brutal governor, it appears. When they removed him from office in the year 36, Caiaphas also was removed from the high priesthood, and so it looks like he was in cahoots with Pilate during his governorship. So the high priest, Caiaphas, and the chief priest are responsible for having Jesus arrested. There's nothing implausible about a local offender being brought before the local authorities. In this case, Jesus is brought before the council of the Jews called the Sanhedrin. It's hard to know much about the Sanhedrin during Jesus' own day. We know a lot more about what later Jews thought the Sanhedrin should be like, but in Jesus' day it's hard to say exactly what the Sanhedrin was. It appears to have been a kind of council that provided advice for the high priest. Jesus then appears before this council, the Sanhedrin, and has a kind of preliminary trial before them. Unfortunately, there's no way of knowing exactly what happened in this hearing of Jesus before this council, in part because we're hampered by our sources. According to the early Gospels themselves, the only people present in this trial of Jesus before the Jewish authorities, the only people present were Jesus, who was going to be executed the next day, and the Jewish rulers, who presumably weren't available for interviews later by Christians who wanted to know what happened. The followers of Jesus themselves weren't there. Our sources indicate that they had all fled, gone into hiding, probably fearing for their own skin. If they've arrested Jesus, then probably they're going to get the followers next. The disciples have all fled. And so it's hard to know what happened in this trial because the only people there are people who won't be able to give us the information. The real problem, though, is that it's difficult to understand the trial proceeding as it's narrated in our earliest source because it doesn't actually make sense in our earliest source. What happens is the high priest asks Jesus, this is in Mark chapter 14, verses 61 and 62. The high priest asks Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus says, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest screams out blasphemy, tears his garments, and they say that Jesus then deserves to die. The problem is that the account as narrated doesn't include a blasphemy of any kind. For Jesus to say, "Yes, I'm the Messiah," is not a blasphemy. There's nothing blasphemous about calling oneself the Messiah any more than it's blasphemous to say, "Yes, I'm the President of the United States," or "I'm the I'm the President of the Southern Baptist Convention." I mean, I may not be, but it's not a blasphemy to say I am. There's nothing illegal about it. There were Jews that we know about who called themselves Messiah, and there were Jews that we know about that the leading religious leaders of the Jews called the Messiah. Messiah simply means a future ruler of the people. It's not blasphemous to say so. It's also not blasphemous to say, "You'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." That's simply to say that, yes, Daniel was right in the Hebrew Bible that it's going to happen and we'll be alive when it comes. There are other prophets saying the same thing. To say so was not a blasphemy. What then was the blasphemy? Well, some people have thought that since Jesus answered, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus answered, "I am," that was the blasphemy. That Jesus was taking the name of God, "I am," as the name of God. That's a common explanation for this, but I think it's completely wrong. Because, in fact, that's simply how you answer a question in the affirmative, throughout the New Testament. In the Gospel of John, there's a man who's born blind that Jesus heals. He's brought before the authorities, and they say, "Are you the one who is blind that Jesus healed?" And the man replies, "I am." Same words. He's not claiming to be God. He's just answering the question. Jesus is asked, "Are you the Messiah?" And he says, "I am." So I don't think that's what's going on. I think the only way to explain what's going on is to assume what Mark, the author of the Gospel, assumes about Jesus. Namely, that Jesus is the Son of Man. That's what Mark assumes. If you assume that Jesus is the Son of Man, and he says, "You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven," then you would think that Jesus himself is a heavenly being. Well, that would be a blasphemy. In other words, from Mark's perspective, the high priest would think this was blasphemous. But if you think about historically what would happen in the trial itself, the high priest wouldn't have Mark's perspective that Jesus is the Son of Man. And so it doesn't make sense as a historical narrative, because it wouldn't work. There wouldn't be a blasphemy committed. But it would make sense as a theological narrative. Mark, in other words, has written this account in order to show that the Jewish authorities found Jesus guilty of blasphemy, even though blasphemy does not appear to have occurred. In short, we really can't know what happened at Jesus' trial before these Jewish authorities. In conclusion, let me tie together what I think we can say about Jesus' final hours before he appears before the governor Pontius Pilate. Jesus was almost certainly betrayed by one of his followers, Judas Iscariot, who appears to have divulged to the authorities some of Jesus' secret teachings that he had been giving to his inner circle of the 12. These teachings concern Jesus' own identity, something that he was loath to discuss publicly. But Jesus appears to have thought that he himself would have a place of prominence and importance in this coming kingdom that he was proclaiming, that he would be appointed by God to be the ruler of this kingdom. He taught his disciples this privately, evidently. Once the local Jewish authorities learned of this, they had all the grounds they needed to make a quick arrest to get Jesus out of the public eye. Working stealthily, they had him arrested at night and brought him into an informal investigation, an informal interrogation. We don't know exactly what happened there at this interrogation, but it clearly was enough to make the authorities hand Jesus over to the Roman governor for trial. That's where we'll pick up the story in the next lecture.